Welcome to the video lecture on engaging students in online courses. Before we get started with the presentation, I'd like for you to get a sheet of paper out and just reflect on your own engagement in this course and jot down some of the challenges and some of the factors that influenced or affected your ability to be engaged in this course. And once you get those things jotted down, I want you to look over them and ask yourself, how might some of these same factors affect my students' abilities to be engaged in my course? You know, it's probably been a while since you've been on this side of the screen where you're not in the role of the instructor facilitating the course. And so I feel like it's a worthwhile activity to just take a few minutes and reflect on some of the factors and some of the challenges and the barriers that our students face in being engaged and remaining engaged in our online courses. In this presentation, we're going to talk about what student engagement is. We'll talk about how motivation and active learning contribute to student engagement. We'll look at some of the cognitive science and the role of memory in the learning process. And then after the presentation, I'll ask you to go to our online Padlet board and share one of your favorite engagement strategies so that we can have a centralized location from which we can still get ideas from one another. Elizabeth Barkley's Handbook for Student Engagement Techniques is the text that I got the majority of content from, both for the module and for this presentation. And before she offers her own definition for student engagement in this book, she reviews a good bit of the research in the literature on student engagement. And so I feel like it's worth reiterating here kind of an assumption and an implicit understanding about student engagement that the research shows abundantly. And that is that there is a direct and positive correlation between student engagement and student achievement. So that is, the more a student is engaged in the course and engaged with the instructor and engaged with their peers, the better that they perform in the course and the less likely they are to drop the course. There's also several other definitions mentioned in this book that essentially define student engagement as being a prerequisite for learning to even occur. And so as you can see in the visual here, the way that Barkley chooses to define student engagement is the intersection between motivation and active learning. So we'll take a few minutes and we'll look at each of these components in a bit more detail. In her discussion of motivation, Barkley mentions two very prominent theories of intrinsic motivation. She first starts by talking about self-determination theory, which basically says that for a student to be self-determined and take that self-initiative that we want them to, we must first create an educational setting that satisfies three innate needs of our students. That is, that we create a setting in which they feel they have some degree of control over their learning. We create a setting in which they have a feeling that they can learn or become competent in the content that we're presenting. And we create a setting in which there are opportunities to relate socially, both with peers and with the instructor. And so what self-determination theory says is that when all three of these elements are present in an educational setting, we have students that are more likely to be self-determined, and as a result, we have students that are more likely to be intrinsically motivated to complete the task that we put in front of them. Barkley also talks about the expectancy value model, which says that the effort that a student puts forth is equal to the product of the degree to which they expect they can succeed and the degree to which they value the outcome or the activity itself. And so I feel like the word product is kind of a key word here. And so we'll go through this chart and kind of look at each one of these sections and relate it back to the fact that we have a product here of value and expectancy. So we'll start in the upper right hand side of the chart, and here we have success unexpected, right? So we don't have expectancy here. We don't expect to succeed, but we do value the task. So this would be nothing in terms of expectancy being multiplied by value, right? Because when we're talking about a product, we're talking about multiplying two things. So anything times 0, as your math review for the day, anything times 0 is always going to be equal to 0. And as we move down here, we have no expectancy to be successful, and we don't value the task. Okay, so obviously there we're going to have a result of 0. Moving over here, now we do expect to be successful, right? So we have expectancy here, but we don't value the task, right? So our result is still nothing. So the only part on this chart where we have a desired outcome is when we expect to succeed and we value the task, right? So in this case, we have expectancy multiplied by value is equal to our motivation. So what is active learning, and how does it relate to student engagement? And also, how does cognitive science view active learning, and what is the role of memory in active learning? So those are the things that we're going to look at next. Active learning has been one of the most common buzzwords associated with education in the last decade or so. And there's been this kind of misnomer that in order to have students be engaged in active learning, that we have to put on some sort of dog and pony show. We have to have some sort of elaborate lesson plan, or we have to have people getting up and out of their seats and actually being physically active. So the first thing that I want to say right off the bat is that is indeed not the case. So according to Barkley, active learning means that the mind is engaged, that students are participants in their learning, and that they are reflecting and monitoring both the processes and the results of their learning. Okay, so this goes back to that autonomy and allowing students to feel a certain degree of control over their learning. Not that we have to allow them to, dictate, how much percentage the tests are worth, but, simply just by the nature of being an online course, students have a certain amount of control over their learning. So we have a bit of an advantage in that regard, just inherently. We also have this aspect to active learning that we are providing opportunities for reflection and self-monitoring, right? Another way to kind of define those two things is a word called metacognition, or thinking about one's thinking. And it's something that doesn't come naturally to a lot of our students. So that's something that we'll have to intentionally design into our course structure, and we will have to model this for our students, because they're not going to know how to self-monitor and how to self-reflect. We have to design the course in such a way that we provide opportunities for this. And then at least up front, we have to model for them how to take advantage of those opportunities and how to reflect and what types of questions to ask yourself that get you on the right track to self-reflection and effectively monitoring your own progress. So we've talked about cognitive load a little bit in the first module, and so this is just a little diagram essentially of cognitive load. So just as a quick review, we do have 3 different types of cognitive load. You've got extraneous load, which are all those things in our instruction that really don't need to be there. We have germane load, which is the stuff that we do want to be in our instruction. And then we have intrinsic load, which we don't really have a whole lot of control over, right? So we have these two, the extraneous and germane load. Both of these we can control just by how we design our instructional materials. The intrinsic load, on the other hand, we have less control over, because this is just the inherent difficulty of the subject, right? So Algebra 1 is going to be, or is going to have less intrinsic load than, say, quantum physics. Some things are just inherently more difficult than others. And so what cognitive load says is that if we take all 3 of these, that must be less than the limited resource that we have available to process information. And we call this limited resource our working memory. Okay, so let's look at what is the role of memory in receiving and processing information. So as our information comes in, our working memory is initially what receives this information. And we can only really process 3 to 5 chunks of information at a time. So think about your own instruction and think about how much material you cover in one class session, and think about the cognitive load that you're placing on your students' working memory. And are they able to really even process the amount of material that you're throwing at them? So once we present the information, we must then provide opportunities to retrieve that information from working memory. Okay, so you see this is an ongoing cycle here. We need immediate retrieval practice and delayed retrieval practice so that we can take that information and begin to store it in our long-term memory, which does have unlimited storage capacity, right? So we can store as much information there as possible, but we have to have the proper stimulus provided by our instructor in order to retrieve that information from our long-term memory. And so as we organize this information in our working memories and store it to our long-term memories, what we're building are these things that we call schemas. And in our working memory, we really just have, kind of 1 or 2 of these things connected. And then as we begin to store it in our long-term memory, we begin to build more and more complex schemas. And then we begin to be able to take one schema and connect it to another schema. And ultimately what we're after is the ability to take all of these kind of less complex schemas and combine them all together for a extremely complex schema that involves content from different areas, so that we can transfer our knowledge from one context to another context, from the context in which we learned it into some new and unique context. So we'll end the presentation by talking about just a few things that I heard in a podcast last week. And originally I was not going to include this in the presentation. But again, I heard this last week in a podcast, and I just thought, man, this ties in so well to all of the things that Barkley had talked about in her book. And so what Felton said in this podcast is that for students to be engaged, there are 3 things that they must think and 5 things that they must do. So in terms of the 3 things that they must think, they have to think they belong here. I belong here at this institution. I belong here in this course. and I belong here in that I can learn this material, right? They have to have a sense of belonging and a sense of community. And so both of these things go back to what we talked about earlier, that a student expects a certain amount of success. And then also students must think that that the information is meaningful, right? Or that they place some sort of value on this information. And then he also says that there's 5 things students must do, right? So students must put time and effort forth, right? So that's something that we have very little control over, except that we can provide them with motivation, right? The more motivated a person is, the more time and effort they're going to put into that. So if we can get them to think those 3 things, that they belong, they can learn, and that they find it meaningful. So if they have expectancy and they have value, then they have motivation. So that's going to directly impact the amount of time and effort that they put forth, right? And they must also give and receive feedback, right? So a lot of times we forget about the fact that we can provide opportunities for students to give feedback to one another and also to us, right? So we should give them opportunities for providing peer feedback, and also give them opportunities to provide us with feedback about our courses, which is a great way for us to make revisions to our courses and make them better. Students must also have opportunities for practice, right? Both independently and guided practice. And the guided practice is, sometimes harder to do in the online setting, but we do have, these instructional technologies available to us that make that possible. It's harder to accomplish, but it's not impossible to accomplish. And then students must also have opportunities to reflect. So you have to provide these opportunities. Okay, so I had a bit of a technical difficulty there. So the last thing is that students must have an opportunity to reflect on their learning, right? So you must prompt this. This is not going to just happen on its own. Students are not going to inherently be self-reflective creatures, right? So all of these are facilitated by you. And all of these tie back into what we've already talked about. And so I just thought that it was worth mentioning this after I heard it in that podcast, because again, it just, all of this ties so wonderfully into the things that Barkley has in her textbook. So now it's time to head over to Module 3 in Moodle, and you have a Flipgrid post. So you'll just click on the Flipgrid link there, and you'll have a prompt for that. And right below your Flipgrid post, you have a Padlet link. And again, the prompt for that is in the Moodle course. So I look forward to hearing your responses in Flipgrid and seeing the strategies that you share in the Padlet board.